Hello there, this is Pramod Nair of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad, and today's session will be the first of several on literary posthumanisms. Many critics now trace a genealogy of posthumanist thought, and this has meant returning to texts right from the European medieval literature to the present, in which they find an abundance of monsters, the alien, the machinic, and other, shall we say, non normative humans. To them, this indicates a long standing interest in other forms of the human's interactions with the environment, and the role of the non human. Literary texts, right from the famous Beowulf to contemporary fiction about clones and genetically modified creatures, are examined for their interrogation of the boundaries of the human and the non human, the hybridization of the human, the chimerical creatures that emerge as a result of this hybridization, the prosthetic and other modifications to the human that we now see. Uh, but as these critics point out, there has been a long standing tradition of such creatures where the boundaries of the human have been explored. Campana and Mesano have noted that Milton, Rabelais, and other European writers were very conscious in rejecting their anthropocentrism, and they celebrated the animal human hybrid as they celebrated the non human. Uh, they have discovered and unpacked this anti anthropocentric, perhaps you can think of it as a preliminary posthumanist stance in several traditions of the visual arts. And many authors in the medieval and early modern, that is European early modern period, were interested in themes of disability, as in differently formed bodies, and monstrosity, again, differently formed bodies. For example, Grendel in Beowulf. Uh, People have noted that the traditional figure of the perfectly proportioned human have been inverted. It humanizes the animal and animalizes the human in paintings like Titian's Flaying of Marsyas, where such a human is no longer a normative. Then, of course, you have the famous Beowulf, the medieval monster, in conjunction with contemporary ideas of disability, seem to show that the non human and the different bodies might represent other ways of inhabiting the world, and that the hero and the monster are equivalent in their, shall we say, more than human virility. The hero must be more than human in order to combat the monster, as people have argued when in the readings of medieval literature. A.S. Monstroso argues that the monster actually serves the cultural function of allowing the human to carve the very notion of civilization from a landscape perceived as corrupt or evil, and which Monstroso characterizes as a humanist project. What are we looking at here? We are looking at the fact that literary traditions, particularly in the medieval period in European history, have been interested in calling into question what we understand as the normal human. So, hybrids, disabled peoples and forms, prosthetic, uh, chimerical, all sorts of forms that have peopled and populated these texts were often also texts that critique the idea of the monstrous or the freak. So, what we tend to dismiss as abnormal, as deviant, or as weird, freak, or etc., are actually forms of social critique which ask how we have constructed the idea of the normal. which is why the monster so quote, are there other ways of inhabiting the world? What are those ways? These texts point to this particular question or throw up this particular question. Stephen Herbrechter and Ivan Kallis, two of the more significant post-humanist thinkers writing now, especially about literature and literary texts, note the fact that Shakespeare's humanism is marked by the unpacking of the figure of the human. That Shakespeare's humanism questions the figure of the human. And as Herbrechter and Ivan Kallis note, this is accompanied by an attention to the non-human. And there are quotations that they have accepted. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction, from Merchant of Venice. The projected inhumanity, the repressed, the self-hatred which returns, as Herbrechter points out in his essay in the same volume. And Rainer Emig notes that in plays like Pericles and Timon of Athens, Timon and Pericles turn themselves into aliens and disappointed humanists, which, according to Rainer Emig, is misanthropic. And this misanthropy unsettles the foundations of humanist sociality, which means to say that in these texts, when Shakespeare is very busy dismantling the human, Shakespeare is also giving space, giving some credibility to different forms of the human. You might think of it as the abhuman, you might think of it as the inhuman. So, the point I wish to emphasize here is that there is a tradition in literature where the human has not been an automatically accepted form or creature, that the human has been very often questioned. How did the human come into being? What constitutes the structure, the constitution, the personality of the human has not been automatic. It has come into being through certain historical projects, through certain historical epistemes, the word that Foucault uses. And Foucault will note the fact that the human was invented during the Renaissance, which is to say that we found ways of talking about the human. We had anatomy, we had physiology, we had the law, we had medicine, we had, of course, theology. Then, of course, we have literature. So, to adapt a title from Harold Bloom, Shakespeare's invention of the human is also a questioning of the human. And the figure of the alien, the outsider, is central, as we know, in Shakespeare's thinking, because at some point, the arrival of the alien, the arrival of something that doesn't fit the category of the human, is a form of interrogation of the social construction of the human. So Shakespeare blurs the human-non-human boundary. Caliban, as a half fish, half human, is a hybrid, right? And Prospero and Miranda refuse Caliban's enlistment in the ranks of humanity. Caliban must remain a villain, a poisonous slave, hackseed, full of malice, and at some point is referred to simply as the thing. Some of you will know that the making of a creature who is supposed to be like a human in Mary Shelley's novel is always referred to as a creature. No name is given. This is a human, or is it not? We do know that humans have names. So what if you invent something which doesn't have a name, which for instance may simply have just a number? So it's important to understand what Shakespeare is doing here. In the creation of Caliban as a human-animal hybrid, you are asking questions as to how a human is defined, how do we characterize the human, and who is included in the category of the human. Then, of course, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, as Karen Raber has pointed out, the artisan performers are the rude mechanicals, where the term rude is not about bad ways of speaking or mannerlessness, which is how we interpret it now. But at that point in time, in Shakespeare's time, rude indicated not only stupidity, but a lack of reasoning, the lack of a rational mind, which, as we know, has always been linked to animals. Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream embodies the human animal distinction, but Bottom also crosses the human fairy boundary. Then there are other hidden hybrids where characters are touched with the impurities of nature. All right. So, as Karen Reber puts it, the fragmented or disabled human forms in Shakespeare allow us to imagine the dominance of the Enlightenment body self dyad, body slash self, which is not natural nor inevitable. What we mean by this? What we mean is that our sense, our notions, our ideas that there is a body and there is a self is itself a social construction. It's not natural. It is how we have come to define ourselves. And Karen Reber is pointing to that. Karen Reber's essay also looks at Troilus and Cressida, whose Ajax is not merely one brute, but is a conglomeration. At one point, Alexander describes him in this way: valiant as the lion, churlish as the bear, slow as the elephant. Now, think of this description: valiant as the lion, churlish as the bear, slow as the elephant. What is this Ajax? Is it Ajax one creature or many? Does Ajax have the qualities of one specific species or many? For people reading Shakespeare through this post-humanist lens, as these examples show, Shakespeare is not convinced about a normal or normative human and is probing. What do we mean by this? Shakespeare is, of course, writing well before the present day, where prostheses, genetic manipulation, and different forms of chimerical hybridization have become easier, not cheaper, but definitely easier and possible. But Shakespeare is not looking at the kind of creatures we see in AI or Transcendence or any one of those sci-fi films. Shakespeare is calling into question the kind of normative human that existed at his time. And of course, myths and stories in which there are these hybrid creatures anyway. Remember, hybrid creatures, chimeras, shapeshifters, have been intrinsic and integral to cultures all over the world. They're not unique to any particular culture. They have different forms. So in Titus Andronicus, the lecturer Saturninus is, of course, beastly and full of passion, but has the specific sexual predilections of the satyr, the man-goat hybrid. Beatrice is a harpy in Much Ado About Nothing, and Ariel is received as a harpy in The Tempest. Now, what are all these images doing? What are all these characterizations doing? All these characterizations show that Shakespeare is probing the boundary of the human and the non-human. And this is important because we cannot think of the post-humanist or post-humanism as only a 21st century invention. People have been concerned with how the human has been defined, what has been excluded from the human. You will remember that in Shakespeare's England and pretty much all of Europe, at some point the Catholics were excluded from the category of the human. The gypsies were excluded from the category of the human. Women were excluded, working classes were excluded, and of course the other races, the black and the brown races who were being discovered during the time, were all deemed to be less than human. So it's not a 20th century invention. There is a history of post-humanist thought that we should be aware of. We move a few centuries ahead. And this is William Blake in Auguries of Innocence. To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. It's a well known uh, verse. It's often seen as a precursor to the Romanticist movement in English literature. But these lines also capture the entanglements of space, time, and matter, right? To see the world in a grain of sand, a heaven in a wild flower, infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. It's a very entangled image. Space, time, and material, as in matter, are all coming together, and that's a post-humanist vision. But the most famous one, arguably, is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And we must remember that Frankenstein is the name of the scientist and not the creature. The creature actually does not have a name, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. Victor Frankenstein is a scientist who creates this life form. So let's turn quickly now to Frankenstein. Frankenstein is actually interesting because an offspring arrives without a maternal body, without a womb. So, in many ways, it's a radical rupture in the politics of reproduction because it's Victor Frankenstein who gives birth, in a manner of speaking, not literally, but produces an offspring. And the laboratory where Victor Frankenstein works is actually the womb, right? And this is a post humanist approach to reproduction because there is no maternal body, right? The creature's body is post human because it is between species, it is between human and non human communities. It is made up of several, as we know, he puts together, as in Victor Frankenstein puts together body parts from various bodies and then creates the creature, right? So we do know that. So the post-human body, in one sense, is an amalgamation, right? It's a body that situates itself somewhere between species. Neither here nor there, both here and there. Is it this or that? So remember that the creature, the monster as it's called in the novel, Mary Shelley's novel, is made up of body parts from dead bodies. Dead bodies, right? So, in many ways, it's a post-humanist vision where organic matter comes out of other organic matter. That at some point there's a cyclical nature of life forms and the chemicals that make life forms. Uh, People like Sandy Burnley have also noted that Alice in Wonderland could qualify as a text about posthumanism, where, for example, the caterpillar has a particularly unique posthumanist identity, where the gardeners, the human gardeners, try to eradicate the species, but it survives. They're misidentified, but the caterpillar survives. For people like Sandy Burnley, who's written a lovely essay on Lewis Carroll's classic text, is that the point she makes is that you cannot think of Wonderland, as in Lewis Carroll's Wonderland, as a homogeneous place or nation of sympathetic humanoids. And I'm quoting here. It demonstrates that humans have very often a very dangerous impact on other species. And this we know because we have already looked at environmentalism and its intersections with posthumanism, that humans tend to have a very adverse, very dangerous effects on other species. But there's also, of course, a posthumanist vision of environmentalism, or you might think of it in the reverse, environmentalist posthumanism, which calls for attention to other life forms and the interactions between the human and the non-human. Be that as it may, Quan Wong, writing on Edgar Allan Poe's *The Imp of the Perverse*, criticizes anthropocentrism, as in Poe criticizes anthropocentrism because it decenters human identity through its three essential coordinates, which is species, space, and time. Then, of course, we come to the 20th century. The 20th century marks the rise of several genres within science fiction that take us right into the heart of posthumanism. Okay, you can think of cyberpunk fiction by Philip K. Dick, William Gibson. William Gibson, of course, is the person who coined the term cyberspace. And in 1984, when he wrote Neuromancer, also created the first set of anxieties about artificial intelligence and computers taking over the world. You have the science fiction cyberpunk of Bruce Sterling, Rudy Rucker, David Brin, and Neil Stevenson. Cyberpunk is important because it inaugurates several modes of thinking about the posthuman and the posthuman's intersection with other sci-fi genres. So the posthumanist science fiction, also cyberpunk, are actually mergers, generic mergers, if you want to think about it like that, right? Then we have, of course, in the early 20th century, Isaac Asimov, whose fiction did much to popularize and question the new science of robotics. At that point, the new science of robotics. Contemporary science fiction and speculative fiction has several themes. The role of multiple fluid identities, artificial beings, transhumanism, artificial reproductive technologies, and of course the Anthropocene. In many cases, sci-fi, and not quite sci-fi but coming close to it in its posthuman interests, would be novels like Dave Eggers' The Circle, Tom McCarthy's Satin Island, where there is a dystopian view about the loss of humanity in worlds dominated by technology. Then, of course, we come to novels like Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun, which would be about artificial beings. We have transhumanist fiction in novels like Don DeLillo's Zero K, where there is the possibility of a future where you can be brought back after death to enjoy a new life. The bodies collapse, can be reinvented, stored, etc. What we have looked at here in a very compressed form is a history of posthumanism right from the medieval to the present. Posthumanism in literature, shall we clarify that, but also philosophically. So the normative questions of the human have been addressed in certain ways, and various configurations, the human-animal hybrid, the human-machine hybrid, the disabled body, quasi-divine, quasi-mystical bodies, are all part of this. So while we have monsters, in one sense, in the early modern period in texts like Beowulf, we have the creature constituted by dead body parts, or body parts from the dead in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We have the cyberpunk of the 20th century, where humans are implanted with chips, their prosthetic limbs, and things like that. We have novels like Larissa Lai's Saltfish Girl, where again the human-animal hybrid is center stage. All of these are attempts to question what the human is. So posthumanism in literature has a very long lineage, and in all cases it points to the artificial constructed nature of the human. Thank you.